Welcome back for what is going to be the last online lecture for spring 2020. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. Make sure you watch to the end. I'm going to tell you, what goes on as far as grading and everything for the rest of the semester. So make sure you watch and pay attention to everything. So let me start by sharing my screen here, and you'll see working out a Blackboard just so you understand where to find the slides we're working off of. Click on lessons and right here, slides for week 11. So I've already opened those up. And where we were was the evaporative emissions monitor. We had just finished talking about fuel system monitor, oxygen sensor monitor, and so now we're on the evap monitor. I could spend 2 whole lectures probably just speaking about the evap monitor because different manufacturers have implemented it different ways, and even among manufacturers it's changed over the years exactly how it's done. So I can't really hope to cover every single variation of the evap monitor, so I just want to talk about what it's intended to do. Let's start with that. Evaporative emission systems, of course, their purpose in life is to catch fuel vapors and instead of letting them escape from the fuel tank, somehow capture them and then eventually feed them back into the engine so that they're used as fuel instead of just escaping into the atmosphere as vapors. Gasoline vapors, gasoline is a hydrocarbon, and hydrocarbon emissions are considered bad by the EPA. So in the old days, you go back to the 60s, we had gas caps that had vents in them. Why would you need a vent in a gas tank? You have to think about what happens if you take a sealed container, and most of you have probably experienced this. You have a gas can, a sealed gas can. If it's in a warm area, when you open it, a lot of pressure escapes from it. Or if it was filled when it was warm and then it goes into a colder area, or usually as night falls, it cools down. Then when you open it, there's vacuum inside it. The same thing would happen to a gas tank. If there's no way for air to come in and out, or vapor to come in and out, actually vapor out, air in, what would happen is you would fill the car up. Let's say you filled the car up at night, or you filled the car up first thing in the morning when the sun's not beating on it. Relatively cool. You put a gas cap on that has no vent in it. What's going to happen is as the fuel warms up later in the day, or just from sloshing around driving, that agitation will warm the fuel and cause vapor pressure inside the tank. The pressure in the tank would build to the point where possibly it could rupture. The opposite thing as the fuel cools down. So you're driving around, you've got warm fuel. Some fuel's coming back from the fuel injectors from the engine. If you have a fuel injection system or a fuel delivery system that uses a return where hot fuel's coming back from the engine, that's splashing back into the tank, raising the temperature of the fuel. Fuel's very volatile, so we're going to have vapors escaping, and they need somewhere to go, right? So the pressure in the tank is relatively high when everything's warm. Now you park the car, and if it was a sealed system, as that fuel cools and vapor condenses, the pressure in the tank would become negative, in other words, a vacuum, and could actually cause the tank to implode. So it's very necessary to have some sort of a venting system on a fuel tank. Back in the 60s, like I mentioned, 50s, whatever, you had a gas cap with a vent, so when excessive pressure built up in the system, those vapors would escape through the gas cap vent. And when the system cooled down, that gas cap would have a vacuum release mechanism that would let air into the system. So you've probably seen this on maybe an old lawnmower or snowblower or mini bike or something. A gas cap that kind of has a little hole in the center, a vent of some sort. So eventually, when it was determined that hydrocarbon emissions are bad, a system had to be put in place to capture those fuel vapors, those unburned hydrocarbons, and store them until they could then be burned up in the engine. So initially, activated charcoal, or we just call it a carbon canister. So a canister, there were some of them looked like old coffee cans, but they're usually plastic. Would have a hose running from the fuel tank to this vapor canister. And what activated charcoal does is it absorbs fuel vapors like a sponge. So park the car, it's sitting, vapor is escaping from the tank, or you're driving it and it's sloshing around and it's hot, vapor's escaping from the tank. It makes its way to the canister through a hose, a vent on the top of the tank through a hose to the canister, where it is absorbed into the activated charcoal. And then at some point, when the driving conditions are correct, a purge system operates, canister purge. So what does it mean to purge it? What it means to purge it is to take all those stored vapors and pull them out, purge the canister of vapors. And where do they go? They go right into the engine. And then the engine, they're used as fuel. They actually affect the air-fuel ratio. So on a modern fuel-injected system, the computer is well aware of when it's purging the canister and can adjust injector on time and all that to compensate for that extra fuel. And it's obviously watching the oxygen sensors, and there's this feedback loop, so we don't make the engine over-rich by purging the canister. So that's the basic idea of a evaporative emission system. Store fuel vapors until such time as they can be burned up in the engine. So that went on for a long time. Pretty simple. But the problem with that old system is you could take a carbon canister. It could be damaged in a collision. It could be damaged or removed from somebody working on their car. Hoses could crack or rot. And any sort of thing that would alter the integrity of the system. In other words, make it leak. So what would happen then is if you have a cracked carbon canister, right, the fuel vapors, they come out of the fuel tank, and instead of being absorbed by the activated charcoal, they just escape into the atmosphere. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So in the old days, pre-OBD2, what would happen, if you damaged that carbon canister, there were really no drivability symptoms. No check engine light, nothing the customer is going to notice. Maybe a smell of fuel, but usually not. So what does that mean? That means that this evaporative emission system is damaged, but the vehicle owner has no idea. So it can drive around for 10 years with a damaged evaporative emission system, drive around for 10 years, putting hydrocarbon emissions into the atmosphere, which is exactly what the evaporative emission system is designed to prevent. So with the advent of OBD2, one of the requirements was, of course, the onboard diagnostics has to test these emission control systems periodically and make sure they are still working. So the car leaves the factory, they're obviously all working, but 3 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, are they still working? Usually the answer is no. So manufacturers were given the task of testing the integrity of the evaporative emissions system on a regular basis. So they all incorporate, well, no, I'm not going to, I'm not going to make any broad statements. I'll show you a couple of examples, and realized that most systems are relatively similar. So with OBD2, there were some additions, some hardware additions. In the old days, the canister vent was always open, usually just a grate in the bottom of the canister with some sort of a filter. Oops, sorry, I bumped things here. And whenever the purge activated, fresh air would flow in through that vent, flow through the activated charcoal, pick up the fuel vapors, and then they'd be carried up to the engine through that purge line and through the purge solenoid. So the vent was wide open all the time. For OBD2, a vent solenoid was added, so all the fresh air that comes in to vent the canister comes through that solenoid. It's normally open, so when the vehicle's operating and it's not running the evap monitor, that solenoid's open, just like in the old days having the vent open. So for that part, it works the same. Normal operation, you park the car or you're driving the car, whenever fuel vapors escape from the tank, they get absorbed into the activated charcoal in the canister. And then during purge, fresh air comes in through that vent, picks up the vapors, and carries them to the engine to be burned. Where the vent solenoid comes in is during the evaporative emissions monitor. So when it's actively running that test, the vent solenoid is used. So it's not really necessary for the normal operation of the evaporative emissions system. Second thing most vehicles incorporate is some sort of a fuel tank pressure sensor. So that's a way of measuring whether there's vacuum or pressure in the fuel tank. And you saw on the last lab, we looked at that fuel tank pressure on the Explorer, and we saw that when this evaporative emissions monitor was running and it ran successfully, that fuel tank pressure got down to, I think, something like 16 or 17 inches of water, which is a finer measurement than inches of mercury, during the test. And then when the test was over, when the test passed and we saw the check engine light turn out, the fuel tank pressure was allowed to return to atmospheric, basically. Also, the systems incorporated a test port so that test equipment could be connected. And that test equipment is what we typically call a smoke machine that allows us to blow smoke into the system and look for leaks. So the evaporative emissions monitor was added for OBD2, required this extra hardware and then some logic. So the logic is just as important, I guess, because this explains why it's so hard for this monitor to run. Why it takes so long sometimes to complete this monitor. You could drive the car for a week sometimes and the monitor hasn't run. It requires certain conditions. So back up a little bit. What did I talk about? I said when you're driving the vehicle, fuel's sloshing around. So that has a tendency to cause it to vaporize more. Unless you have a returnless fuel system, which have become pretty much standard. Hot fuel is returning from the fuel rail. It got warmed up by the engine. So you have all of this evaporation going on in the fuel tank. It's very hard to test the pressure in the fuel tank when things are so volatile, when everything's really changing. So in order for this monitor to run, everything has to be really steady state. And you'll see later, some allow the monitor to run only after the car has been sitting for quite some time. So, like I say, most manufacturers, the Catalyst monitor, they all implemented it basically the same way. The EVAP monitor has been implemented in a lot of different ways. But most of them require some sort of very steady state situation before the monitor can run with any degree of accuracy. So let's move on to the next slide here. this is a typical, all right, typical evap monitor operation. So the vent solenoid is closed to seal the system. So the vent solenoid, you can see there, I've listed as normally open. So when the monitor is not running, that vent is open. The purge solenoid, which is normally closed, that's open to pull vacuum on the system. In several labs, we talked about the purge solenoid. So back when I talked about solenoids, I showed you that purge solenoid, I can't remember if it was duty cycled or pulse width modulated, but it was not necessarily just an on-off solenoid. It could be controlled with some sort of partial flow. We may not just turn it on and apply full manifold vacuum to the system. We may meter it a little bit with duty cycling or pulse width modulation. So anyhow, so the purge solenoid in some way, shape, or form applies vacuum to the system. It starts drawing vapors out of the system with the vent closed. So what is that going to do? If I start pulling vapors out of the system and I have the vent closed, I have a closed or a sealed system, you should expect the pressure in that system to drop into a vacuum actually. You can't get crazy because if you pull too much of a vacuum on the fuel system, you're not going to be able to pump fuel out of it, up to the engine to let it run. So it's a relatively small amount. And then the fuel tank pressure sensor is looked at, during this, running of the monitor. So we've closed the vent, we started to purge it and watch the fuel pressure, or fuel tank pressure rather, not fuel pressure, totally different thing. This is vapor pressure in the fuel tank we're talking about. And I'll show you a diagram of typical system in a minute. So if that initial pull down is successful, then close the purge solenoid, right? So we're no longer pulling vacuum on the system. Now we're just seeing if it'll hold it. So now the vent and the purge are both closed. And if there are no leaks in the system, it should hold that vacuum. So if it can't even pull it down, initially, it's a large or a gross leak. So this is what happens. You leave the gas cap off. That's a huge leak in the system. I showed you on the, I misspoke when I said Explorer. I really meant the GMC with the C recorder. When the monitor ran and failed, there was very little change in the fuel tank pressure during that test. And then, because of that, the light popped on, a diagnostic trouble code for a large leak was set. When the monitor ran and passed, we immediately, as we watched the canister purge increase, we saw the pressure in the system get pulled into a vacuum of, like I said, about 16 or 17 inches of water. So that was enough to turn the light out. Now, that's not the only evap monitor on that vehicle. Some of them run separate monitors for, to check for large leaks and small leaks. So there will be several different codes on a modern vehicle for exactly what's wrong with the evap system. Okay, we're going to stop there for a minute. And let me just find the diagram I have here. So on ALLDATA, I went and looked up, again, I've just stuck with the same vehicle. This is a 2010 Impala, but this is typical. So here's a diagram of the system. Let me see if I can get this centered pretty well. And let's look at what we have. So the fuel tank here, here's the gas cap and the filler neck. It's got a check valve. Then we have the vent line. So fuel vapor in the fuel tank, so the tank pressure doesn't build too much and blow the tank up. It can vent into this carbon canister. So here's the charcoal canister here. And that's, so the car's sitting, it's a hot day, fuel vapors are needing somewhere to go, you know, they're traveling through this hose, and where do they land? They land inside the carbon canister. Now it's time to purge the canister. So normal operation. I'm not talking about the monitor right now. I'm talking about normal operation. Here's our purge solenoid. I'm sorry, that was not correct. So here's our purge. Doesn't look much like a solenoid. Here's our purge solenoid, number 1. This is some sort of a restrictor. I don't remember. I can look. This here is a one-way check valve that's only on turbocharged vehicles, so pressure from the intake manifold doesn't push back into the system here. So purge flow, when it's time when this canister purge solenoid opens, right, purge flow is here, out of the canister and through the purge solenoid and into the intake manifold of the engine. So obviously we can't just pull vapors out without letting fresh air in, and that's where the vent system is. So here's the vent solenoid right here, and fresh air is allowed to go into the canister, circulate around, pick up fuel vapors, and then out the purge line. So it's kind of a flow-through design there. And that'll purge the vapors from the canister. So that's normal evaporative emission system operation. Now when OBD2 came around, the hardware they had to add, of course, the vent solenoid that I mentioned. Before this was just a wide open vent here. Here is a fuel tank pressure sensor. So that's actually measuring the vapor pressure in the fuel tank. So what will happen when the evap monitor is going to run, the purge solenoid is closed, or the vent solenoid rather is closed, so that blocks off any incoming air. So now when the purge solenoid opens, right, starts drawing fuel vapors out of the canister, and that same suction or vacuum is applied all the way back into the fuel tank. So what happens is the pressure sensed here at this fuel tank pressure sensor starts to drop, and the computer has preset specifications for how quickly that should drop, how much it should drop. Once that part of it passes, right, so we get the correct pressure drop at the fuel tank pressure sensor, then the vent is left closed, the purge is closed, so now this entire system is one sealed unit, and any vacuum in the system should stay in the system, within reason. This is why it's kind of important that when this monitor runs, it has to take into account all kinds of stuff. Like if we seal the system, but this fuel is still very volatile, the pressure is going to rise not because of any kind of a leak, but just because the vapor pressure is increasing due to evaporation of the fuel. So again, it requires very specific conditions for this monitor to run successfully without getting any kind of false readings. So that's your essential evaporative emissions monitor. Put a fuel tank pressure sensor on the fuel tank, close the vent, pull vacuum on it, make sure that it pulls vacuum and then holds it. And whether it's a large leak or a small leak is dependent on how fast that vacuum bleeds off. Or even if the vacuum can't build, that's a gross leak or a large leak. If it does build vacuum, but it bleeds up pretty quickly, that's a large leak. Large leak is considered 40 thousandths of an inch. And if the vacuum bleeds up more slowly, then that's considered a small leak. That's 20 thousandths. So I'd say one of the most common issues that I've seen is this vent solenoid, which is supposed to seal during the operation of the monitor. They usually live in a bad neighborhood. They're back behind a wheel well or something. So a lot of dirt, a lot of water, potentially salt, and so they have a tendency to get contaminated. They have a tendency to fail either electrically or even sometimes they just leak a little bit. Even though electrically they're energized, they don't seal correctly. So that's a really common problem. So that's your fuel tank or your evaporative emissions monitor one style. That's very, very common. If you get into Hondas, they have additional valves. I'm not criticizing any particular car manufacturer, but let's just say that it's more complicated on some vehicles than it is on the other. This system that I just showed you that we're looking at here is relatively simple. All right, let's go back to the slides here a minute. And we'll move on and start talking about the engine off natural vacuum evap monitor. So the engine off natural vacuum evap monitor, which has become really, really popular, takes advantage of the fact that as fuel cools down, if the system is sealed while the fuel cools down, it will naturally create a vacuum in the system. So we can park the car and then monitor the fuel tank pressure sensor. And over a period of time, that pressure will change. So the first thing that happens, typically, you park a car, the fuel in it's just been sloshing around. It's still pretty warm, probably. Still going to be pretty volatile. So when you first park the car, if the system is sealed at that point, so in other words, the vent solenoid is closed, the pressure in the tank will most likely rise. So the evap monitor, the engine off natural vacuum monitor, is going to expect to see a fuel pressure rise initially. So after a period of time, then the vent solenoid can be opened, let everything go back to normal. In other words, back to no pressure, no vacuum, just natural atmospheric. Close the vent again, and now as the fuel cools, we should expect to see the pressure drop into a vacuum. So it's really a pretty simple, application of physics, just the natural volatility of fuel. The fact that when it's warm, it's likely to be letting off vapors that are going to increase the pressure in the system. And then as it cools, those vapors are going to condense and decrease the pressure in the system. I have an example. This is out of that, let's see if I can make this any bigger. I don't know. Yeah. So this is out of that Ford, that Motorcraft Service website. And I have no idea what year I snagged this from for what vehicle. But, there are 5 phases, right? Phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. And I don't know how accurate the time in seconds is here, but, the basic concept is this. Phase 0, leave the canister vent solenoid open, allow things to kind of stabilize. And then phase 1, close the canister vent. So you can see these sections here where the canister vent is closed, and expect the pressure to rise over a period of time. Now, it looks like they're showing us an example of a failure because it never reaches the positive pass threshold. It looks like about 0.75 inches of water. So after phase one, then open the canister vent again, right, and allow the pressure to stabilize one more time, and then close it for the remainder of the test. And through that period of time, as the fuel cools through phases 3 and 4, the pressure drops. If it drops below the negative pass threshold, then that portion of the test is considered to be passed. So there are other. Let's see if I can shrink this back down. There are other evap monitors that older Chryslers, they use something called a leak detection pump that actually it was like a bicycle pump. It actually pumped pressure into the fuel tank or into the canister, the evap system, and the way the pump was operated was a pulsing vacuum solenoid would pull a diaphragm up, and then when the solenoid shut off, a spring would push it down, and then the vacuum would pull it back up, and the spring would push it down. So if you ever think of a bicycle pump, right, pumping up and down, and so it would pull air in, push it into the evap system, pull air in, push it into the evap system, and every time that pump cycled, it would open and close a switch. So when the pressure in the system was low, when the monitor first started running and the pump first started running, the pump would cycle rapidly. So each stroke of the pump would happen pretty quickly. As pressure would build in the system, it became harder and harder for that spring to overcome the pressure in the system and push the diaphragm down. The pump would operate more slowly. So there were just switch contacts that turned on and off as the pump moved up and down, and the computer would monitor how rapidly those switch contacts would open and close. And so what would expect is the switch contacts are opening, closing. They start slowing down as pressure starts feeding back, and then eventually even stop, and then, okay, this system is pressurized. If you pulled the gas cap off, then of course the pump would start going again because it's no longer fighting against that pressure. So it was a little bit strange. I don't think it's in common use anymore. That natural vacuum seems to have become very, very popular across a lot of different manufacturers. It does have a downside. This old Chrysler evap monitor used to be able to force to run with an old DRB, the old Chrysler scan tool. The natural vacuum one, not so easy. It usually requires the car to sit overnight in order for the evap monitor to complete all phases of it. So I talked about the one here while the vehicle's driving, and that's the one you saw on the GMC pickup. It was actively testing it while the vehicle was going down the road, but that's only part of the evap monitor. Then you've got the engine off natural vacuum. That'll detect a much, much smaller leak, but it also takes a lot longer to run. So that's about it, I guess, on the evap monitor. We'll move on now to talk, instead of about monitors, we'll talk a little bit about diagnosis. So I decided I hadn't talked quite enough about the evap monitor. I just saw some things here that I thought would be, probably helpful, maybe. Just a little additional information, not a whole lot more. So, right here, I want to point out, so starting in 2017 model year, federal vehicles can no longer use a 40 thousandths leak check rather than a 20 thousandths leak. So we're talking about, large leak versus small leak, and it's saying, now both California and federal vehicles must comply with the 40 and 20 leak check requirements. So, some other things, just another diagram of the system, right? So showing how the purge typically works. right? Atmospheric air, allowed to come in through the vent solenoid, which is normally open, scoop up the vapors from the canister, and through the purge valve into the intake manifold, so that's purge. And then when the monitor is going to run, vent closes, purge turns on. So what does that do? That pulls, that pulls a vacuum on the fuel tank, and the fuel tank pressure sensor here can see it. So moving on down, so it talks about different phases. Vacuum pull down. This is for the 40 thousandths check, right? It says here something interesting. 2009 model year and beyond require 2 or 3 gross leak failures in a row prior to setting a P0455. On some vehicles, if the initial vacuum could not be reached after a refueling event, a gross leak fuel cap off is indicated. So it's actually even paying attention to the fuel level sensor to determine whether you just fueled the vehicle, and then it's more likely it's a fuel cap thing, right? So like I said, I don't want to completely reteach this what I just talked about, but it shows vacuum stabilization, vacuum hold and decay, vacuum release, and vapor generation. So it's going through these phases, and here's the flow chart for what goes into this. Again, if you want to look through this yourself, motorcraftservice.com under the free resources. I'm again in the 2018 OBD operation summary. So moving on down, for the other monitors, I kind of went through this, and we saw here's the potential diagnostic trouble codes for the 40 thousandths leak check. It happens once per driving cycle. It won't run unless the oxygen sensor monitor is completed and okay. We've got to have certain sensors okay. And the monitoring duration is 360 seconds. And then here's all the entry conditions, right? So this is the tough one. Engine off soak time, or coolant temperature at start minus the intake air temperature at start, is less than or equal to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. So in other words, where the engine is pretty close to outside air temperature, within 12 degrees. So this is the tough one. 4 to 6 hour engine off soak time. Or I suppose it probably takes almost as long for the engine to cool down pretty much to the intake air temperature. And then between 330 seconds and say, a couple thousand seconds, the monitor will run. And then there's another problem here, the fuel level. This is an old trick some people use to keep this monitor from failing. New York State inspection, and I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not giving you hints on how to circumvent the law here. I just want to point that out. But I've seen this done. New York State inspection requires or allows one incomplete monitor. And so you can, if you fix something and clear the codes, rather than waiting sometimes for a week to get this evap monitor to run, it'll pass inspection with one incomplete monitor. So as long as it hasn't run and failed, so it just hasn't completed yet, it'll still pass. So if you have another monitor that's going to fail, and what comes to mind, I guess, is catalyst, right? Well, I'm not. Let's just put it this way: this monitor will not run if you have less than 15% fuel or greater than 85%. So if you want to keep this monitor from running, that's the way to do it. So So malfunction thresholds, I'm not going to read all of these here. Then we get down to the 20 thousandths leak. This is the engine off natural vacuum. So like I said, to catch the large leaks, they're going to use one method, and then to catch the small leaks, they're going to use the engine off natural vacuum method. Obviously the same system here. And the phases that I showed you on that chart, which is probably right here, okay, these phases, it describes them here. So phase 0 stabilization allows the pressure to stabilize after vehicle shutdown. First, phase, we shut the canister vent solenoid. If the system's sufficiently sealed, a positive pressure vacuum will occur. And then the transition phase, as long as we got a positive pressure, then we can basically bleed that pressure off. And then the second test phase is commanding this canister vent solenoid shut, and then watching the fuel tank pressure for vacuum. And then phase 4 is the test complete. So what will make it abort? During the engine off natural vacuum test, several parameters are monitored to abort the test under certain conditions. The primary abort conditions are instantaneous changes in tank pressure and fuel level. So, if you pop off the gas cap, this test is going to stop. So I just wanted to throw that at you. Again, if you want to look in more detail, if you care, and you want to know more about this, this is the, like I say, this is the 2018 model year, but you saw that the list goes all the way back to 1996. So whatever vehicle you're working on, you can check that out. Okay, I just closed everything I didn't want to close. So let me fix that problem real quick. Get back to the vehicle. I don't even know if I need this anymore, but all right. So we are back to the Impala. So let's drop the EVAP monitor now, and like I promised a few minutes ago, talk about the flow of diagnosis. So this is, something that everybody has their own way of doing things. Shop manuals may give you diagnostic routines, diagnostic procedures, and tell you exactly what order to do things in, but they can't account for every possibility. So sometimes you need to use your head a little bit. So let's just look through this slide. It's important to fully understand the customer's concern. I've been burned on this. In a dealership, one of the things you might deal with, which you wouldn't deal with so much in an independent, is people are always complaining about little rattles and little noises on their new car. And while it's under warranty, they want it fixed, even though they would never pay to have it fixed on an older vehicle. And you just turn the radio up. So I can remember clearly one time somebody came in and they were complaining about a rattle. And I took the car for a ride, and oh my God, the spare tire and jack in the trunk were loose and flopping all over the place. So I was like, this is an easy one. And not really even a warranty thing, because I'm sure from the factory, the car didn't come with the spare tire and jack, thrown in the trunk. So the customer just hadn't stowed it correctly. So just, goodwill, whatever, put everything back the way it belongs, tightened it up, and, drove the car, and of course that was gone. So I thought, great, problem solved. Gave the car back to the customer. The customer left, was back shortly afterwards, kind of upset. We hadn't fixed the rattle. And so I went for a ride with the customer, and it was the tiniest little noise coming from somewhere behind the dash that I don't know how you could even hear over the sound of that jack flopping around in the trunk, but uh, it's important to make sure that you're working on or trying to diagnose the correct thing. Another thing, the customer's description may not accurately represent the actual malfunction. I know doctors go through this all the time, and so do we as techs. Uh, they don't necessarily know the right terminology. I've heard, you know, noises called vibrations and squeals and screeches, and that the best thing is if you can verify the complaint, maybe even with the customer, right? Customer descriptions are not symptoms. We have lists of symptoms, drivability symptoms or electrical symptoms, and like every electrical problem, people call a short, even though it's not a short. It's an open circuit. You cut a wire, it's not a short. So you can't really rely on the customer completely for description of what's going on with the car. Another problem is some concerns only happen under certain conditions. So maybe it's only when the engine's cold. Maybe it's only when it sits in the sun. Maybe it's only when it goes over bumps. There have been rumors going back years about cars that would stall every time they went under high tension lines. So every day the guy would leave for work, and a car would stall in the same spot every time on the way to work. And it took a while to finally figure out that it was electromagnetic interference causing the problem. I don't know if that's that could be legend. I don't know if that's really true, but I've had several experiences, several years worth of experiences where a car operates fine except under very specific circumstances. I've driven cars for a long time before they backed it up. So sometimes it has to hit certain conditions, certain temperature, or who knows, maybe even humidity, barometric pressure before the problem actually occurs. So you really want to verify the concern, make sure that it's what you're trying to fix. We were told years ago, if you can't duplicate the customer's concern, whatever you do, don't try to fix it, because then you're acknowledging that there is a problem and you've tried to fix it. So you get into that, and now you own the problem. So make sure you know what you're trying to fix. The next point, after diagnosis and or repair, road test can verify the concern's been corrected. Usually this is a really good idea. With some OBD2 monitors, it may not be possible. So keep in mind, if it takes 3 days for me to get the EVAP monitor to run, if you bring your car to me and it has a large leak, and I discover that the fuel tank filler neck is rotted out, and I replace that, and then I find that the system holds pressure, and I do a smoke test and nothing's coming out, I'm pretty certain that I've fixed the problem, and that it's not going to fail that EVAP monitor again. So I have a choice here. The best way in a perfect world is I would clear that code, and then we would operate that car until the EVAP monitor runs and passes. If that's going to take 3 days, to happen, then you're asking the customer to just leave the car for 3 days after it's probably already fixed. So this is, one example. I don't really like to let customers verify a repair. I prefer to know it's fixed, so in a simple situation, you hear a thumping noise when you drive the car, you pull it in the shop, you pick it up, you find the tire's got a shifted belt, you put a new tire on it, you drive it, the thumping noise is gone. All right, you verified not only the concern, but you verified the repair, you know when you give the car back to the customer, the problem is solved. When it comes to something like an evap monitor failure, it's not so simple. You can't just repair it and then take a quick drive and decide that it's fixed. So sometimes you will have no choice, but whenever possible, verify the repair. So, and the bottom point here, scan tool diagnosis will usually point to the system and or subsystem, but the rest of the diagnosis is manual. So as long as we've been talking about the evap monitor, and for diagnosis, I'm talking about everything, not just the evap monitor, but the failure is going to be pointed out by a diagnostic trouble code. So vehicle comes in with a check engine light, you pull a code out of it, you find out there's a large leak. From there, it's on you. The scan tool is not going to tell you where the large leak is. So you're doing visual inspections, you're doing pressure testing, you're doing smoke testing. That's all manual. Even though a scan tool might be involved, because for a smoke test, you may need to use the scan tool to seal the system, close the vent solenoid. So you're using a scan tool, but it's still a manual diagnosis. It's still the tech doing all the work. Scan tool is just what it is, a tool. So once you've verified the symptoms and identified the conditions, somewhere along the line, you're going to pull the diagnostic trouble codes out, right? And so it's hard to completely, generalize about this, because I'm talking, and all the things I've been talking about recently has all been, powertrain control sort of stuff. We could just as easily be talking about a power window that doesn't work and it's computer controlled. So the symptom, verifying the symptom would be really super easy on that, right? You push the switch, the window doesn't go up or down, you're done with that part of it. There may not even be any diagnostic trouble codes, right? So this flow of diagnosis, it doesn't work for every single problem. This is just a general guideline. That power window, you might jump right to plugging the scan tool in, bringing up live data, and looking at the window switch input and seeing if it's read by the computer. But a lot of things, there are diagnostic trouble codes, and so we're going to retrieve them. It's a good thing to write them down or capture them somehow, in case in what you're doing you wind up deleting them, maybe unhook the battery or something. Determine if they're hard or soft faults. Well, that's we talked about that a lot already, so I won't anymore. So the shop manual, when I say shop manual, I don't necessarily mean a paper book, but whatever your service information is, for diagnostic trouble code description and pinpoint tests. So pinpoint tests, of course, this is where you go from code, which means something's wrong with that system, to pinpointing the exact specific broken wire, bad component, or whatever it is that needs to be repaired. Then, of course, you perform the repair, and this is usually the easiest part. Usually, I say, or maybe the lowest skill level part. Then, once you think you have it repaired, the last two steps are really important, and I alluded to this before. They're not always 100% possible, but important. So, as best you can, verify the repair. So there's a lot of systems that may have no symptoms. We just talked about it in great detail earlier on in this lecture, right? I said in evaporative emission system problem, you could smash well, I didn't say this, I'm saying it now, you could smash the carbon canister with a sledgehammer, and there may be absolutely no symptom other than a check engine light, which means before the evap monitor, this car would have gone another 10 years without the owner ever bringing it in. So, so two reasons why you may have no symptoms. One, vehicles can adapt to malfunctions and operate very close to normal, even if multiple failures have occurred. They have, operating strategies that allow them to maybe calculate things using other sensors instead of the ones, the primary sensors. And then the other thing is many monitors will set diagnostic trouble codes even when the failure is symptomless. So the EVAT monitor is a huge example of that. But another one, Catalyst monitor. In 1990, you could drop the catalytic converter out of a car, take a hammer and a punch, knock everything out of the insides of it, dump it into a garbage can, bolt the empty shell of the catalytic converter back up. Is there going to be any drivability symptom that the customer is going to notice? Absolutely not. And hence the reason for the Catalyst monitor, right, is to ensure that things like that aren't happening, that the catalytic converter is actually still functioning, years down the road. So those symptomless features are the reason for OBD2. So a couple things about OBD2 monitors we need to talk about. Two kinds of diagnostic trouble codes to talk about. There's pending diagnostic trouble codes, regular diagnostic trouble codes, and then illumination of the malfunction indicator light, which normally we're thinking of the check engine light, but there are other malfunction indicators. For example, the amber ABS warning light. So keep in mind, we're talking about monitors, so those are pretty much powertrain related, but a lot of systems have trouble lights, if you will. So let's talk about pending diagnostic trouble codes. This is kind of like if your parents say, if you do that one more time, you're grounded, right? The pending diagnostic trouble code indicates that a monitor has failed, but a lot of monitors require multiple failures before they will set a diagnostic trouble code. So this is kind of like a counter, if you have a two-trip failure, a two-trip monitor, right, or two-trip DTC, we'll call it, that means the first time it fails, we're not going to get a code, we're not going to get a check engine light, but we will get a pending diagnostic trouble code. Now it fails again, and now we get a diagnostic trouble code, we get malfunction indicator light. You saw that on no, you didn't. I was going to say you saw it on the GMC, but we didn't have enough data for that. Okay, so we'll concentrate on the conditions that cause changes to three items: pending diagnostic trouble codes, mill illumination. So we have conditions for setting a pending code or a mill, and then what's called similar conditions for erasing. And we can see the conditions with freeze frame. Okay, so back to the 2010 GM diagnostic trouble code descriptions, right? Type definitions. What you'll see is that we have various types of diagnostic trouble codes, right? We've got a type A, we've got type B, whoops, I missed, type B, we've got type C, and type D. And these kind of are an indication of their severity. So the most serious is type A. So look, it says, actions taken when the diagnostic trouble code sets type A. The control module illuminates the mill when the diagnostic runs and fails. And it records the operating conditions at the time the diagnostic fails. So you would call this a one-trip diagnostic trouble code. There's another type A specific to misfire, so we'll talk about that in a second. A type B diagnostic trouble code. We get a check engine light on the second consecutive ignition cycle that the diagnostic runs and fails. So what I saw with the loose gas cap on that GMC truck was I drove it. I got no diagnostic trouble code. And pretty much as soon as I started it the second time, bam, it came on. Um, so the control module records the operating conditions. This is called freeze frame. You know, the first time the diagnostic fails, the control module stores the information in the failure records. If it reports a failure on the second consecutive ignition cycle, the control module records the operating conditions at the time of the failure and writes them to freeze frame, updates the failure records. This is specific to misfire diagnostic trouble codes. We have a type A misfire and a type B misfire. So type A misfire is considered a catalyst damaging misfire. So what this means is, if you think about the way a catalytic converter works, it takes unburned fuel, so fuel that hasn't been consumed in the combustion process in the engine. And so that fuel is now in the exhaust system and would escape out the tailpipe as unburned hydrocarbons, which is a regulated emission. So the job of the catalytic converter is to take those unburned hydrocarbons, combine them with oxygen. So combustion is oxidation. They are same thing. In the combustion process, fuel is combined with oxygen. In the catalytic converter, fuel is combined with oxygen. So we're basically finishing the process that should have been completed in the cylinder. And the catalyst job is to make that happen. A catalyst is something that creates a chemical reaction between two other things, but does not get involved itself in that reaction. So the catalyst doesn't change. The hydrocarbons and the oxygen do. So in normal operation, when this oxidation process happens in the catalytic converter, there's a lot of heat generated or released, and so catalytic converters run very hot. But as long as the amount of unburned fuel that's being oxidized in the converter remains reasonable, the converter temperature remains reasonable. If, however, an excessive amount of unburned fuel is presented to the catalytic converter, it can overheat, the substrate can melt, and it can be damaged. And catalytic converters are very expensive. So a type A misfire means that the vehicle's misfiring badly enough that you're putting excessive amounts of unburned fuel into the exhaust, and that's going to cause the catalyst temperature to rise to the point where it's going to be damaged. So that's a type A misfire. So that's this line here. If the control module detects a high level or catalyst damaging misfire, the control module flashes the mill at a rate of once per second. So if your check engine light's flashing at you, stop driving. Catalytic converters are very expensive. If the control module detects a low level or an emission level misfire, meaning, okay, we're not overloading the catalytic converter, but we are sending more through it than then we're going to have higher emission levels. If that happens during 2 consecutive trips, the control module illuminates the mill. So this is a much less serious problem. So if the control module detects a misfire during 2 non-consecutive trips, the stored conditions are compared with the current conditions, and when the second misfire happened during conditions that were similar to the first misfire, then the computer decides, okay, there's a problem. So there's this term called similar conditions, right? So similar conditions here, right? And I'll tell you where this comes from. This comes right out of the shop manual. Engine load is within 20% of the previous tested failed. Engine speed is within 375 RPM, and the engine coolant temperature is in the same range. So, that's what we're talking about here, right? So, So let me try to explain this. If I have a misfire on one trip and it occurs at 4,000 RPM under 60% engine load, and then the next trip I have a misfire that happens at 2,000 RPM, 10% engine load, those are not going to be seen as repeat problems. In other words, the first misfire and the second misfire are not going to be seen as related to each other at all. So it won't be considered a second failure. So back to ALLDATA here, right? So as far as turning it off, conditions for clearing a Type A or Type B misfire. All right. The control module turns off the mill after 4 consecutive ignition cycles that the diagnostic runs and does not fail. You know, Type A actually, Type B misfire, when the misfire stops, the check engine light's not going to be flashing at you anymore, but it will stay on. A current DTC clears when the diagnostic runs and passes. A history DTC clears after 40 consecutive warm-up cycles. So we need to talk about warm-up cycles. What is a warm-up cycle? So to be considered a warm-up cycle, the engine temperature has to rise by 40 degrees at least and reach 160. So if we drive the vehicle and it's at 190, we park it, run into the store, we come out and it's at 170 and we drive it again, you know, goes back up to 190, we've only had a 20-degree swing there. That's not going to be considered a warm-up cycle. Again, if I start the car and like the Explorer the other day you saw was only at like 80 or 90 degrees when I first started it, if I let that run for 2 minutes and shut it off, right? So it's only at like 120. That's not a warm-up cycle. So a warm-up cycle, it goes up by 40 and hits at least 160. Now, think about this. I have a diagnostic trouble code, all right, and so that GMC, when I loosened the gas cap, we got the check engine light, and then when I tightened the gas cap, after that monitor ran and passed, the check engine light went out. But I'll guarantee you that code is still in there. It's been a few days, and so it's actually it's been quite a few days. I guarantee you I haven't gone through 40 warm-up cycles. And how long does it take to do 40 warm-up cycles? That depends on the specific use of that vehicle. Let me give you 2 examples. Example 1, little old lady goes to bingo and church, right? So Sunday morning, starts the car, drives to church, temperature hits 160, we have a warm-up cycle. There's one. In church for an hour, so it's probably going to drop 40 degrees. Depends on, if it's 20 degrees outside, obviously it's going to drop quite a bit. So old lady comes out of church, drives home, we get another warm-up cycle. Now bingo is Wednesday, right? So they're all the rest of Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, no warm-up cycles. So come Wednesday, jumps in the car, drives to bingo. There's warm-up cycle number 3. Bingo for a couple hours, comes out, the car's cooled down more than 40 degrees, drives home, warm-up cycle number 4. Every week, Gertrude is doing the same thing, church and bingo. 4 warm-up cycles per week. It's going to be 10 weeks before the diagnostic trouble code is erased from the memory in the vehicle. Unless it's manually cleared with a scan tool, or unless it's cleared by unhooking the battery or something, but just by normal driving, it's going to be in there for quite some time. So if Gertrude came to me and said, hey, my check engine light was on, now it's off, And I say, when was it on? And she said 2 weeks ago. If I plug a scan tool in, I'm probably still going to see whatever code it was that caused that light to go on. So let's take someone like you. Maybe you're a college student, which you are, and working a part-time job somewhere, which many of you do. And, you have some sort of a social life, right? So Monday, wake up, drive to school, one warm-up cycle. You're in school for an hour or two, let's say 2 hours. And so you've got a morning lecture and an afternoon lab, right? So the morning lecture, it ends. So you jump in your car and maybe you go home. Maybe you don't live that far, but it's a cooler day, so the vehicle has cooled down and now it warms up again, second time. So you've been to school and back, and so that's 2 warm-ups, right? Now it comes time for your afternoon class. You drive back to school, and that's a 3rd warm-up cycle, and then you drive home from school again. That's a 4th warm-up cycle. You grab something to eat. You drive to work, warm-up cycle number 5. You work for a 4-hour shift or whatever, drive home, that's warm-up cycle number 6. Now your friends call you and they want to go out, so you jump in your car and you go pick your friends up and you go wherever it is you go. That's warm-up cycle number 7. You're in there for an hour or two. You come back out, warm-up cycle number 8. One day, 8 warm-up cycles where the little old lady would take 2 weeks to do the same thing. So there's no set time for how long this lasts. If you come to me and say your check engine light was on a week ago, I'm probably not going to see what caused it because that code's probably already been erased because of the 40 warm-up cycles. So, and this is only if the problem doesn't recur. If the problem happens again, you get another monitor failure, of course, it's going to, reset the timer. So under what conditions will DTC be set? DTC. So the answer to that, a monitor has to fail at least once, and depending on the monitor, maybe multiple times in order to set a code. So a lot of times what happens is first failure, pending diagnostic trouble code. Second failure, diagnostic trouble code and check engine light. Then, depends on the monitor we're discussing. So pending DTC, a monitor has failed at least once, but not enough times to cause a DTC. They're a counter for the computer to decide if a problem is extremely intermittent. So, we're going to basically, if monitor fails, we're taking note of that, and we're looking to see if it fails again. Successive failures make that pending DTC become an actual DTC, and they are erased after a number of successful monitor runs under similar conditions. So we know what similar conditions are, right? Go back a couple slides. 375 RPM, 10% load, same engine warm-up state. So regular DTC, a monitor has failed at least once and has failed enough times to set the DTC. So we do have one-trip codes that, they'll set as soon as there's one failure, but a lot of them are multiple trips required. They're erased after 40 warm-up cycles without a failure. What kinds of different codes do we have? Powertrain begin with a P, so most of the ones we've been talking about are powertrain codes. If you have a problem with, let's say, your anti-lock brakes or a electric power steering, something chassis related, that is going to be a C code. So if you've ever seen a wheel speed sensor code, it begins with a C. Body codes. There are a lot of modules that you would call body. Driver door modules, body control module, passenger door module, driver's seat module. There's a lot of them. And then U codes. So U codes are network communication problems, and we've talked about these in some of the labs in the past. So under the P code, for example, there are 4 digits typically. So let's look at those digits. Obviously it's alphanumeric, so the alpha, the P, we're not calling that a digit. And then immediately following the P, it could be a 0, it could be a 1. And so the rules are, when OBD2 came out, and all these diagnostic trouble codes a lot of things were standardized. So if the second, or the first digit, right, after the P is a 0, then this is an SAE code. This is a generic code that you could get on any manufacturer's car. If the digit after the alpha, like this P1000, there's a 1 following the P, that means that is a manufacturer-specific code. So this may be the only manufacturer that has that code, and in this case, P1000, I believe that's the case. Only Ford uses it. Then the next digit, right, identifies which system. So we know misfire codes like a P301, right, is a misfire on cylinder 1, or a P0300 is a random misfire sort of thing. So the 3 in that spot is, if you look, is ignition or misfire. So transmissions, P07 something, transmission code. Fuel or air, P0171, a lean code. So P01, we're talking about fuel or air. So, these are broad categories, right? And then the last digits are the specific, problem. All right, so we talked a little bit about these types and classes too. Type A, Type B, Type C, Type D. I only really went over Type A and B. So if we go back to all data here, C and D are non-emission related diagnostic trouble codes, right? So A and B are emission related. So Type C, and this is not to be confused with any of the digits in the code number, right? I'm not talking about C for chassis code or B for body code. I'm talking types, Type A, B, C, or D. So the action taken when there's a Type C DTC, the control module stores the information into memory, and the mill does not illuminate. The control module stores information into failure records. Maybe the driver information center displays a message, but not the check engine light. So a current Type C diagnostic trouble code clears when the diagnostic runs and passes. History clears after 40 consecutive warm-up cycles. So, we talked about hard faults, soft faults, current and history codes, or we can clear it with a scan tool. Type D, control module will take default actions. No DTC will be stored. No mill or service vehicle soon light illuminates. So in other words, Type D, nobody ever knows it was there unless you happen to check with a scan tool. So I've seen vehicles that come in, they have no lights on at all, but you do a code scan on the vehicle and let it just scan all the modules, and there's 10 different codes in there. So you never know. Let's go back to the slides here. Got to get finished up. What causes the malfunction indicator to light to come on? And we saw this in the shop manual and for the Chevy. It's a hard fault or a monitor has failed at least often enough to set a code. It'll be turned off after a number of successful monitor runs under similar conditions. We know what those are, right? So, that's kind of hopefully a good overview of the OBD2 monitors, the types of diagnostic trouble codes, what sorts of things happen when monitors fail just once or when monitors fail multiple times. What does it take to turn on a check engine light? What does it take to make it go off? Just because the light's off, does that mean the code is erased? Typically, no. How long does it take for that code to be erased if you don't erase it with a scan tool? We know that the amount of time is variable. It's 40 warm-up cycles. So you can look back through these slides. They're available on Blackboard. These were the slides for week 11, I think, is what they were entitled. So I'm going to say now we have reached the end of the semester, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about, how the grading is going to happen here. Normally, any other year, you do written tests in class, and the final is huge. We're not doing any of that this semester, as you know. So my objective right from the start was, we've been throwing a really serious curveball. So what are our options? We can just throw our hands up and say, there's no way to do this. Give you all incompletes. Or, like I said at the very first video I put together, I will give you the opportunity to complete the class. No guarantees, just an opportunity. So if you're watching this and you know that you have watched all the videos, and this goes for lecture and lab, if you've watched all the videos, if you've sent me reports, and I mean actual reports, not 5 sentences, but put some effort into them. If you have taken all the tests and quizzes that I put on Blackboard and done halfway decent on them, then you're going to pass the class. Unfortunately, some of your classmates, no matter how many times I reached out, I got nothing, so I'm giving no incompletes at all. If you've stayed with me through this, then I'm going to say there's a pretty good chance you passed, and if you're due for graduation, that's going to happen, and I'm happy about that, because when this first happened, I didn't know how we were going to do it. So for this video, I'm not putting up a quiz. I think I've put enough quizzes out there. We're really short on time. The current quiz has a couple days or 1 day left, I think. So let me talk about that a little bit. I've had a few of you reach out to me and say, Bob, I didn't get the quiz done in time. Is there any way you can still let me take it? And most semesters, that's a hard sell. It means you kind of blew me off. This semester, I get it. There's a lot going on. I have students that have kids. Those kids are home from school. Those students are trying to get their kids through school. There's one computer in the house. It's very, very difficult. I get that. So I'm being more lenient, I would say, than typically I would be. So if you're sitting there watching this and you say, damn, I missed the quiz for lecture 3, or I didn't get the lab report in on time for lab number 2, or something like that, you need to contact me. And email is the way to do it, or my phone. My office phone is forwarded to my cell phone. Call my office phone right now. It's going to ring here. So no excuse. If you're watching this and you know that you're behind on something, you better get a hold of me. Semester ends Tuesday. It is Thursday right now. So there's not a whole lot of time. And then, of course, I have to turn in grades pretty soon. So once that happens, changing a grade is not so easy. So if you're behind, if you owe me stuff, you better get a hold of me. You better email me. You better call me, and I'll see what I can do. Um, Other than that, I'm glad I was able to do this. And for those of you that this enabled you to finish up and be done, I'm really happy about that. And congratulations if you're graduating. We're not having a regular graduation ceremony, so um, I wish you luck in your careers. Or some of you, I'll be seeing again. I'm not saying necessarily people that have failed, but not everybody's on the same schedule. So for some of you, this may not have been your last semester anyhow. For those of you, I'm not exactly sure what to expect in the fall. We are trying to figure out how to run that. I think there's going to be a lot more online instruction going on. So maybe we'll see on that. Anyhow, that's it. Uh, I'll sign off and wish you well.